We are live, going live here. It's Tuesday night home Bible study with Word of Life Family Church, and it is Tuesday, April 19, 2016. Can you believe we're almost more than halfway through April of this year? It's crazy how time goes by. And we'll be in 1 Samuel 28. We'll be picking up with verse 11. And if you're studying with us with the outline, we are on page 63. Well, we'll review over page 62 at the bottom, because we were in the middle of a heavy discussion last week and we had to stop. So that's where we'll be picking up. And if you didn't get to be here with us last week, you can always go to the YouTube lesson and find out what we talked about last week.
Well, we had some last week, didn't we? Was that 2 weeks ago?
Well, we seem to have problems frequently, but hopefully it's all there, what we talked about. So we'll go ahead and I told you the page number, 60, what did I tell you? 62, 68.
63 is what?
You said the bottom of 62. Yeah, 63 is where we start the new stuff.
Okay, bottom of 62. All right, let's go ahead and open in prayer, and then we'll just jump right in with a little review, and then we'll get into our scriptures. Oh, Lord, we are so thankful for your goodness, for your many blessings. We're thankful for birthdays. We're thankful for birthday cakes, all those wonderful good things, Lord, that you've blessed us with. We thank you for that. We invite you, Holy Spirit, to be among us as we study. We know you're here because we bring you with us when we gather, but we just ask that you would be our teacher tonight, that we can learn about God, we can learn about ourselves, we can learn more about the Word, and then have understanding. And we thank you, Father. We pray that you give us understanding, and that we not just go by man's ideas, but that you would give us understanding. Amen. And we thank you, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. We started at lesson 7, which was actually titled "A Tragic Ending for a Bitter Man," and this is following what happened after David managed to pass by his second test of whether or not he would kill Saul. And he passed that with flying colors. He didn't, and they parted ways. But David was still afraid of Saul once they parted ways for that last time. And so he wouldn't stay in Israel. He went ahead and went back over into Philistine territory, we saw last week, back to Gath, which was where King Achish was still in power. And
that's amazing. He went back there. That was
the place that they threw him out after he pretended to be insane when they recognized him.
So this is the same king.
It's the same king.
And this is where Goliath was raised, right?
And yes, and Goliath was from Gath, and so there were probably
and David had Goliath's sword with him.
Yes, yes. And so you know that there were probably still some of the giants were still probably part of the people who lived in that particular territory. But this time Achish actually accepts him. We talked about last week how it's possible it could have been the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation, because David's the enemy of Saul and Saul is the enemy of Achish. So he thought, well, I'll accept David, and then the two of us together maybe could gang up on Saul if that was the case. And so he stays there, and when Saul finds out, people did inform on David and told Saul where he was, that he was in Philistine territory. It says that Saul no longer searched to hurt David after that point, once he heard that he was in Philistine territory. So
wouldn't that have made him more mad? Because it's like, the guy that served me is now with my enemies. Wouldn't that make you more suspicious and more crazy?
You would, especially because David and his men continued to do things. He actually asked Achish for a city, claiming that he and his men are not worthy to be in his royal city, and he asks for a city. And remember, we found out that these 600 men that were with David all had their families with them as well. And so they were like a traveling town. There could have been 3,000 people easily, even more easily.
With all their cattle.
And with their possessions that they had with them, anything that they had taken from spoil in the places they've gone. And so the king actually gives them the town of Ziklag. And if you're curious where that is, it is on your map, on your page 2 in your booklet, right there, right on the edge of Philistine territory, right where it butts up against Judah and the territory of Simeon. And so he gives him Ziklag, and so they settle there, and then David and his men go out and pretend to raid Israelite cities, when in reality they were taking out Israel's enemies. But yet King Achish thinks that David is going and raiding Israelite cities.
He's thinking the people that hate him because of that?
And, well, David doesn't tell the guy any differently. He lets him believe that he is raiding Israelite cities. Yes, David was very deceptive.
But that was a good kind. That was a good kind.
Well, I don't know if there is a good kind.
Yeah, no, but you're deluding your enemy.
But he did not technically lie. He just didn't tell him everything.
Yeah, but Achish assumes that David is doing this. Okay, he believes that David is actually loyal to him after all these raids. In fact, when David would come back from raids, Achish would say, "Well, where did you raid today?" And David would say, "Oh, here and there." He would never be very specific.
Exactly. So he wasn't lying.
Yes.
The word never got back to him.
But Achish totally believes that David is on his side and loyal to him, and so he thinks that this is a real boon for his army, and he makes David a captain of the garrison of his army.
Because all these guys would have been there when he killed Goliath, the giant slayer.
It's possible. We don't know for sure.
Took off running.
This is many years later, so we don't know. So anyway, the Philistines are gathering to attack Saul's army. And Saul is panicked. Remember last week, Saul was panicked because he had no way to get any information from the Lord. He could not inquire from the Lord anymore.
Ephod.
Remember, there was no prophet that he could get information from. He couldn't get a spiritual dream because God wasn't really speaking to him anymore. Plus, he no longer had the Urim and Thummim to be able to inquire of the Lord there because he killed the priest. And the only priest that we know of right now that's alive right now is the one that escaped and is with David's men. And so David has the ephod with the Urim and Thummim and a priest amongst his men. And so he can't get guidance from those other ways. And so what does he do? He asks his servants to find what? He asks his servants to actually find a witch because he wants to know what he's supposed to do about this invading army of the Philistines.
He must have felt incredibly desperate.
He was very desperate. He didn't know what to do. And remember, and it does tell us right there that Saul had already banished all witches and all form of sorcery out of Israel that he knew of, and had made it basically almost like a death situation for anyone that was found practicing witchcraft. Because in the law, it was totally forbidden.
So how did he know to ask his men about this? And they actually found somebody.
They found someone.
I mean, hold it. If they knew, shouldn't that person have been obliterated?
Can I make an example?
Yes.
Drugs are illegal in the United States. People still find ways to get them, and people still find drug dealers, and they still do drugs. Right. It doesn't matter that it's illegal. It's still there. People find ways around the law
the black
to be able
market.
to do what they want to do.
And obviously, that's what happened here, is because a servant actually knew that this woman existed and was a witch, and you would think that Saul would have killed the servant who even suggested this. But yeah, maybe he didn't have a spear in his hand. That's true. But anyway, Saul is told about this woman, and he disguises himself so that the witch will not know who he is. And when he comes to the woman at first, he asks for a medium, and when he comes, at first she refuses to do anything. She goes, "No, I'm not going to die over this thing." And he says, "No, I promise you, no harm will come to you. No harm will come to you." And so, in fact, he says, "As the Lord lives, no harm will come to you." And we thought it was rather ironic that he swore by the Lord that he wasn't going to hurt the witch.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
so paradoxical.
Oh,
it's
man.
ridiculous.
Talk about compartmentalizing his faith. I mean, it's just...
And so I wanted us to look back at verse 11, and let's start there and remind ourselves what happened when the woman found out what Saul wanted her to do, and then what actually happened. This is what we were talking about when we ended last week. So we read 1 Samuel 28, and we'll start with 11.
The New Living Translation. Finally, the woman said, "Well, whose spirit do you want me to call up?" "Call up Samuel," Saul replied. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, "You deceived me! You are Saul!" "Don't be afraid," the king told her. "What do you see?" "I see a god coming up out of the earth," she said. What does he look like? Saul asked. He's an old man wrapped in a robe, she replied. Saul realized it was Samuel. He fell to the ground before him. Why have you disturbed me by calling me back? Samuel asked Saul. Because I am in deep trouble, Saul replied. The Philistines are at war with me. God has left me and won't... Excuse me. He didn't say that. The Philistines are at war with me, and God has left me and won't reply by prophets or dreams. So I have called for you to tell me what to do. But Samuel replied, Why ask me, since the Lord has left you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done just as he said he would. He has torn the kingdom from you and given it to your rival David. The Lord has done this to you today because you refused to carry out his fierce anger against the Amalekites. What's more, the Lord will hand you and the army of Israel over to the Philistines tomorrow, and you and your sons will be here with me. The Lord will bring down the entire army of Israel in defeat. Saul fell full length on the ground, paralyzed with fright because of Samuel's words. He was also faint with hunger, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. When the woman saw how distraught he was, she said, Sir, I obeyed your command at the risk of my life. Now do what I say. Let me give you a little something to eat so you can regain your strength and sit back. But Saul refused. The men who were with him also urged him to eat. So he finally yielded and got up from the ground and sat on the couch. Continue. The woman had been fattening a calf, so she hurried out and killed it. She took some flour, kneaded it into dough, and baked unleavened bread. She brought the meal to Saul and his men, and they ate it. Then they went out into the night.
Okay. So I told you last week that this is quite a disturbing event for most people who study through here. And most scholars cannot agree on what happened. And it's funny because Jeremy said he was talking about this with his bus driver, and the next day he's a preacher too. And when Jeremy brought it up, he says, "Oh, that's a tricky one." That's a tricky one, and we found that out because scholars cannot agree on what actually happened in this situation. And I told you that there were 5 common interpretations for what happened here, according to different interpretations. And some of them we could see could possibly be, and then others it's like, oh my goodness, I don't know how that could be. And then I told you which one I kind of leaned toward. Okay, the first one was that the medium actually did bring Samuel up, that the witch actually did bring Samuel up from death. And then some say that God, not the medium, sent Samuel to Saul. Not because of the medium, but God allowed Samuel to go talk to Saul. Then some say it was a demon, or maybe even Satan himself pulling off a deception. And so there are some that believe that. To me, there's no evidence there that it's a deception, because everything that the person said was actually truly said before to Saul. I don't know.
So somebody had to know.
Yeah, somebody had to know. The fourth idea is that the witch actually faked an apparition, and then the fifth one...
But how'd she know all that stuff?
Exactly. And then the fifth one was that the experience was actually a hallucination brought on by Saul's severe hunger. Okay. And so I told you last week that I leaned towards the idea that God allowed Samuel to show up, and I told you why. I felt like that maybe it was because the medium, her reaction was so severe of terror when she saw something happen. She had not even done anything yet, and this personage came up out of the ground.
Adam Clark says it this way. He's got a real good point. He said, this sight alarmed the woman. It was what she did not expect. In this, she could not recognize her familiar. She was terrified at the appearance.
Yes, because she hadn't done anything, and it was so different from anything she had ever seen. It scared her.
Scared the devil out of her?
Yeah, it put her into terror. In fact, the actual Hebrew says she screamed in terror when she saw this come up out of the ground. And notice she didn't know who it was. She just described him. It says it looks like a god came up out of the ground. Now, this last week, I went and I searched through a whole bunch of different commentaries other than the ones I had before, and they were all still disagreeing and debating amongst it. They all had different views. But most of them did center on the part about that the woman did not know what it was that was coming up against, so it was totally unfamiliar to her, so to the point that she was terrorized by it. And so that's why most of them don't think it was a demon or Satan, because the woman was used to dealing with demons and Satan. That's what she dealt with all the time, with familiar spirits, all the time in her witchcraft that she used. But for her to be afraid of what she saw, it had to be something totally different from what she was used to dealing with. Also, go ahead, Nina.
Oh, I was just going to say, usually when mediums have spirits, it's not a person, it's just a voice or, you know, some kind of blurred thing.
Right, it's not normally appearing as a person, you're right. Normally, if it's a demonic thing, it's usually just speaking through somebody. But this one, yes, or a shadow or an image of something, and yet here you have an actual physical person that come up out of the ground. We don't know if he was given a body or it was just his spirit that was seen in the form of his. Our spirits, according to the teaching I've had, our spirits look just like us. In fact, if you read, I don't want to go into that, but there's a lot of New Testament proof that our spirits, our glorified bodies, will basically have eyes, just like Jesus had after his resurrection. He had eyes, he had a mouth, he spoke, he ate, all those things that we know about. Our glorified bodies will have that. But we don't get the idea that this was a disembodied spirit, because she just saw him coming up out of the ground, and we don't know. It could have just been a spirit in the form of Samuel. But I believe that this God actually, before the woman did anything, actually sent Samuel to Saul. That's what I'm leaning towards. Samuel had the knowledge. The man who spoke to Saul had quite a bit of knowledge of conversations that had happened a long time ago. And he says, you know why this is happening. The Lord rejected you. Okay, we talked about that last week. Also, Samuel, at the end of what's said there, he gives a prophecy of what's going to happen to Saul and his sons. He says, this is not going to be a good war. You're going to be defeated terribly, and you and your sons will die. And so basically this is the death of prophesied. Saul's end, basically, is prophesied there. Well, we discussed the idea also that it could have been an angel. But yet, when I went back and I looked at all the various translations and all the various commentaries, there was not any of them that said that they thought that it was an angel here that was trying to parade itself or masquerade itself as Samuel. That there was no evidence for that. There's far more evidence that it was actually Samuel that was allowed to come back and do that. Now, last week, Jess had a hard time with the idea of thinking that God can be involved in this at all, with the witch being involved. And do you have something?
Oh, no.
Oh. I thought you had a massive idea you were going to share with us. Anyway, the woman had not done anything. And that's what several commentaries pointed out, that this apparition or whatever it was happened before the woman had done anything. And several of them did point that out. And to me, that's a clue that the woman didn't really have any involvement in it. It was not her that conjured up this person and that was speaking to Saul. It happened before she even did anything, and that's part of why she was so terrorized. And so anyway, you can believe what you think on that, but I told you last week that there are some references in Scripture, because some say that there's no scriptural support for the idea of a righteous person or a righteous dead being seen by the living. That's in your notes there. But I counter back that there are a few New Testament cases that do talk about the righteous dead being seen by the living. Okay, and so I wanted to show you those, and there are a few cases. So if it happens in New Testament, it's very possible that it could have happened in the Old Testament as well. We have the idea in Mark chapter 9, verse 1 through 8. Let's see. Cool, if you could find that one. And let Sally get her word and all that out there. And Sally, if you could find Matthew 27:50 start at verse 50. I think I had 52 in your thing, but I want us to start at verse 50 of Matthew 27. And then, Jeremy, if you could find Revelation 11:3, we'll see some information there about some things that are going to happen that haven't necessarily happened, but it fits in with this category. So we're talking about the idea that a righteous person could be seen by a living person.
The righteous,
the righteous dead. The righteous dead being seen by the living. Of course, we all know that Jesus was seen by more than 500 witnesses after he resurrected from the dead. But he resurrected from death and continued on the earth for several days, for close to 50 days. But then he went on and was ascended into heaven without dying again or anything. We know that Lazarus was actually resurrected from death, but then we know he later on died another natural death. He did not live forever. But here we have an idea of righteous dead, Old Testament saints. This is Elijah and Moses being seen by the living in Mark chapter 9, verse 1 through 8. Go ahead, Dwila.
Jesus went on to say, I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the kingdom of God arrive in great power. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for you. He said this because he didn't really know what else to say, for they were all terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my dearly beloved son. Listen to him. Suddenly they looked around. Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them.
Okay, so here we have a case, New Testament, where the righteous dead, 2 of the main Old Testament characters, prophets, Elijah and Moses, were actually seen by Peter, James, and John, who were living during the time of Jesus. Jesus actually stood and talked with them as well. This is what's commonly called the Mount of Transfiguration experience. And notice there that they went up to this mountain to be apart by themselves for prayer, and before their very eyes, Jesus, actually some believe he kind of stepped into his glorified state, or into a spiritual state of being out of the light and the raiment and everything shining, glorified, in a sense of glorified. And the idea of like how Adam and Eve before the fall, their bodies were surrounded by glory, so they never did see or notice any nakedness at all until after the fall, and then that glory had departed, and then they were seen as naked.
Love to know what they talked about? Wouldn't it be
love to know
amazing?
What they talked about. I teach on this in our when I do the Gospels Bible study, and that's one of my things in there. I would just love to know what Elijah and Moses were discussing with Jesus. Yes, I would love to know if they were talking about future events, or if they were talking about something, brought some message from the Father to Jesus. But the Father talked to Jesus all the time. So it's just interesting to me that here they are together, and they're seeing this brightness and everything. But it's interesting that Peter did recognize them to be Moses and Elijah. How did Peter know that's who they were? They had never seen Moses. They had never seen Elijah. But yet they just knew.
Heard the stories and heard the descriptions.
It could be, but then they just may have just had to know that when they saw Jesus standing there, the Holy Spirit revealed to them this. Oh wow, that's Moses and Elijah.
Was this the bald-headed prophet?
Elisha was. Elisha was the bald-headed prophet. Yes. So this is one example of living people seeing righteous dead people. And actually, with conversing, we're not told that they heard anything that was said, but they did know that it was Moses and Elijah that was talking to Jesus. And they were so overcome with the awesomeness of it, they wanted to build tabernacles for each of them there, like as if they could contain them in that spot, you know. And so, anyway, this is one segment where you see righteous dead people being seen by the living. All right, Sally, if you could read us Matthew 27, verse 50 to 53, we're going to see that there are actually dead saints that come back to life at Jesus, when Jesus gave up the ghost on the cross. That actually, when the earthquake happened, graves were opened. Go ahead and read that from verse 50.
And Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in two, from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks were rent, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints that had fallen asleep were raised. And coming forth out of the tombs, after his resurrection, they entered into the holy city and appeared unto many.
Okay, so here we get dead saints that could have been numerous ones, could have been all the righteous dead, for all we know, broke out or came out of their graves after that earthquake. Their graves were opened when the veil was rent in two, and it says many bodies of the saints who were dead were brought up.
That would be a good
resurrected.
indication, because he took death and took what was it, Hades or whatever, hell.
Mm-hmm.
He took Abraham's bosom up to the Father, took the righteous dead. So you wonder if this is the first part of another
Of their resurrection.
rapture or whatever.
Yes, definitely was a resurrection. And what's funny is it says they appeared to many people, so people who would have been able to recognize them and know them as dead saints. For Matthew to be able to write about it, he would have had to know that people recognized them as people who were dead, and that yet they were seeing them on this day when Jesus died. And so that's another example of righteous dead people being seen by the living in this particular instance. Okay, and then Revelation 11, verse 3, we're going to see the two witnesses are spoken of this way, where they would be seen to die and then be seen as living again. Go ahead in verse 3 through 6.
And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will be clothed in burlap, and will prophesy during those 1260 days. These two prophets are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire flashes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. This is how anyone who tries to harm them must die. They have power to shut the sky so that no rain will fall for as long as they prophesy. And they have power to turn the rivers and oceans into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they wish.
Okay, and if you go on later, you'll see that later in Revelation it says that they do die, and it says the whole world witnesses their resurrection. The ones that have been dead for 3.5 days, they're dead. They lay there in the streets. The Antichrist is trying to show off that he's finally killed off these two witnesses, and they're laying in the streets, and it happens that the whole world is able to see them raised up. So that particular prophecy couldn't be fulfilled until we have the satellites we have today, where something can happen across the world, and in 30 seconds it's on our TVs. Through CNN, the news networks, Fox News or whatever, you would see breaking news immediately, and so that we are in a time when this could definitely
Hold the celebration, guys.
But what I wanted you to see here too is that some believe these two witnesses are actually Elijah and Moses that are sent back to earth, and they take that based on what is talked about in verse 6, because it talks about they're going to have power to shut up heaven that no rain falls. Who in the Old Testament did that, declared there'd be no rain? Elijah. Elijah's the one that said there would be no rain, that the skies would be shut up. And
he prayed again.
When he prayed, and then it didn't rain again until he prayed that it rain again. Also, it says they have power over the waters to turn into blood. Who did that?
This is the plagues.
Moses. And who did call the plagues on the earth? It was Moses. That's why many believe that this will be Elijah and Moses. Others say that could be Elijah and Enoch, because Elijah and Enoch are the only Old Testament people who did not die a natural death. And some will say that it's Enoch and Elijah that are these two witnesses. So that's one of those things, again, where depending on what commentator you look at, they're going to have a different view. It doesn't matter to our salvation, but it's just kind of interesting.
How did Elijah die? I don't remember.
He was taken up in the fiery chariot.
Remember the chariot?
Oh,
The
yeah.
fiery chariot. Yes, that's
You know,
not Elijah.
Elijah, if you see me.
And with Enoch, it was he pleased God. He walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him.
And Enoch was the seventh from Adam?
Yes, and their bodies were not found. Elijah went up in bodily form and was translated. Basically, it was like what a rapture is, of what we think of as a rapture.
Moses' body was never found.
And Moses' body was never found either. We're told that he was buried.
Yeah, we're told
that God buried him. Yeah, we're told that God buried him. But Elijah, he went up in the flames, and then Enoch was gone and did not die. And so it could be any of those three that are the two witnesses. But I just find it interesting that they have the same kind of powers that they used when they were on
earth. The reason
people
people say is those two have not died. But anybody that goes in the rapture will not have to face death. They'll be translated immediately.
Right. And that's what some people call Elijah's death. Well, the death, it wasn't a death. It was basically a rapture. He was taken from earth to heaven without dying. And so in the air, he was given a different body, to go to heaven. I mean, it was changing. And we don't have his earthly body.
1 Corinthians 15 will be changed in the moment.
In the moment, twinkling of an eye. Yes.
Okay,
so there is some scriptural evidence about the idea of righteous dead being seen by the living. So we can't use that as a disclaimer for the witch situation, saying, well, that's not biblical. Well, there is evidence that there are cases where living people have seen righteous dead. So it's possible. Did any of you have any more thoughts on it as you've gone through the week and just contemplated the idea? Any ideas? I know we talked about several last week. I'm not saying that's actually everything that happened. I think that her faking the apparition was not a part of it, or she wouldn't have been terrorized. I don't think it was a hallucination, because if it was Saul's hallucination from hunger, how did the witch see it? She wasn't starving from not eating, but she saw it too. So, and it scared her to the core. And it all happened before Saul just says, I want to see Samuel. And before she really even did anything, she started seeing this thing coming up out of the ground, and it was a person, and she described it as a god. So apparently there was some glory surrounding him that she wasn't used to being exposed to either. Okay, so anyway, like I said, it doesn't affect our salvation, but it's just kind of interesting to think about how all that really happened. All right, now what did Saul do when he heard Samuel's message to him?
Did he fall on the ground?
Yes, he fell on the ground in fear. And of course he was faint with hunger anyway, because he hadn't eaten. He just heard Samuel, the prophet that he trusted most, even though he didn't obey him all the time. He was still the prophet that Saul trusted, and he hears that he and his sons will die, and the kingdom would be given to David.
Does that include Jonathan?
Saul already knew that David was going to be the next king, and but here he said that Saul and his sons would die the next day. So now Saul knows for sure that his dynasty is not going to continue, just as Samuel had told him way before. The first time he disobeyed, God had said, your dynasty will not continue to your sons. And the second one was that God had rejected him the second time Saul sinned. And here we see there Samuel is telling him, okay, this is it.
Is there any more about this witch in the Bible?
No.
So we don't know what happened to her?
No, we're not told anything once she
this could have been life-changing? She may change occupations after this?
You'd hope so. She wasn't even supposed to be in Israel anyway. For some reason, she stayed there. But it wasn't until after all this happened that, once she saw Samuel, then she knew that it was Saul in front of her. Saul's disguise no longer.
I wonder if the Tanakh talks about that.
I'm sure there is, and I'm sure there's a lot of oral tradition that's about that as well, which could be interesting. Anita sent me some stuff from Josephus, and
Really?
Josephus was a New Testament historian, and he wrote some things on this issue too. But it didn't give us any newer information than what we had. It just kind of solidified most of what was already there. And but just interesting that even the New Testament historians wrote about this instance. Because, the witch of Endor. Now, she knew who he was. Finally, she's like, man, the king is in my house. And so she immediately starts to try to host the king when she realized the king is in her house. And he says, no, I don't want anything. But yet the servants urge him to eat because he was so faint and he'd just gotten this terrible news. And so she goes and kills a fatted calf and fixes them some barbecue and some unleavened bread, and yes,
Prodigal king.
and then they eat, which the meal that was probably Saul's last meal prior to his death, and then he goes back and he joins his army. And it's the very next day that we're going to read here in a little bit when we get back to Saul. Okay, so we leave. Saul is left there, heading back towards where his troops are, and then the story switches back to what's going on with David, because here the Philistines are getting ready to.
Did these guys have any further things about the witch of Endor, about this?
I already asked him.
Does it
Nobody
still
said
bother you?
anything.
Does it still bother you guys?
Yeah,
Bothers Jess, but we don't have a definitive answer for sure.
that's what bothers me.
Have
Yeah.
you
I like
have you
that.
come to any other ideas?
No other.
I come to the idea that I'm not going to know, and
Quiet
it doesn't
Jason, I wanna
matter
hear.
to my
It's one of those
salvation.
things.
So
Mhm.
I'll have a long chat with God about that.
What did they
Okay.
teach in Bible school about this? Do you recall?
A
Anything?
long
Nothing?
time ago, I don't.
Yeah.
I
Well, I don't even think
learning about this
they
story
didn't
yet.
bring this up
Did
when
they
I
ever
was
teach
in
that?
Bible
Yeah.
school. They didn't even talk about it. It's like they just put right over it, like they didn't want to deal with it.
I mean, they did a Old Testament survey, New Testament
Yeah.
survey, but they
Kinda
didn't go in
stupid,
depth.
yeah.
Yes,
It's
and
it's
that's
just
what I
basics.
had. Old Testament survey. Yeah, and
Yeah, we
yeah,
didn't have that in my
'Cause-
college.
no, well, I didn't.
Because
I
if they
didn't
if they did that, then it would take more
Yeah.
than a semester.
Yeah.
It'd probably take
Oh yeah.
2-3.
Yeah, doing Dwila's.
Well, look at how
Dwila's-
many hours it takes us to go through this.
Oh,
you know,
Sally,
we do this
do you
for
have
months.
any?
Yeah, we should get accredited so we can
Do you have any handle on this now?
No thoughts
Not
on this?
really. I was just thinking, obviously, the witches, or whatever you want to call them, necromancers, do have the power to call up dead
Yes, they
people.
do. It's either demons or familiar spirits, or even the spirits of the dead.
Yes,
Yes.
spirits of people who have died.
Mhm.
So, could they call up Christians or believers as well as
Well, you hear about Christians go to seances and, trying to,
Yes.
and then the demon spirit doesn't work because there's a
Believer
biblical
around.
Christian there.
heard that.
Yeah,
Or
I've
if
heard-
there's
I've heard
backslidden
situations with
Christians. Oh, who was it? Who was it that?
It doesn't matter.
No, I'm just where he went to seance and it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
There is a Christian in our midst.
Yeah, they couldn't get the seance
Can't
to
get
happen.
the demon spirit to come
Yeah.
up.
And
And-
so,
and let me question two more people. Good.
Yeah.
Any other
on
interesting
the
thoughts
spot.
about this?
On the spot.
Does it bother
I'm
you?
going on.
Not really. I mean, I've read the story before, so
Mhm.
no.
Okay, what about you guys on Google Plus, Anita? I just want to hear for a second.
Anything different? No?
No, the only other thing I've been watching some people who have died, and they told about their experiences. And one young teenage boy, he was 16 and had some kind of a heart condition in school, so he was dead for quite a while. And he said he saw his grandmother and his mother, and they looked to be about 30 years old. But he just said he knew. He just knew who they were. He couldn't recognize them, but he just knew.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when our pastor in Sacramento, Wayne Clark, when he went into that hospital, remember he got that,
Just tell
Disease
the
or
story
whatever?
and you do it.
and so he went in the hospital and he was near death,
Mhm.
and he saw his friend
A
walking down the
fellow
hall of the
pastor.
hospital.
We saw him walking down the hallway past his room, and it found out that the man had been in the hospital and had just died
During that time.
During that time prior to when
When
Pastor
Wayne
Clark
came
saw him.
back, he relayed that experience. Oh, I saw
He saw
walking
David
down the
Freeman
hall.
walking down the hallway.
And they were reporting,
And
they
his
didn't want
wife
to tell
was-
him he had died, his friend
Yeah.
had died.
So he had actually seen him, even though he was still living. He saw the spirit of him
He was
walking
near
down
death.
when he was near death. Yes.
And some people believe that the dead spirits can hang around for 40 days like Jesus did or something like that.
Interesting.
Haven't heard any scriptural evidence for that, but it's one of those things, again, we don't know for sure.
Well, the
But
ones
we
that
do
came out of
know
the
that
graves
there are
walked
disembodied
around
spirits that
Jerusalem
can.
for a while.
Yeah, we don't know how many days those dead saints walked around, or if they died another death, or if they walked around in a glorified state. It doesn't tell us. It just says they were recognized, they were seen around. And it's one of those things where it's like, man, I wish I had more information.
Did the Catholic believe? Did they talk anything about witches and stuff?
They just
Really?
prayed people out of purgatory. They believed that they went to a holding place, right? Anita?
Oh, Lord.
Or
Lord,
Laura,
too.
you know about that?
I'm sorry, what?
In the Catholic faith, he was asking about that.
If they talk much about witches or dead like this.
No, not that I know of.
They believe in purgatory, that they're in a holding place and you can pray them out of purgatory,
Oh, okay.
right?
Right, purgatory, right.
Yeah, that's how the Catholic
Okay.
work that. Okay, so we're going to, right now, the story switches now back to David, who is with the Philistines over in the Philistine territory, and these Philistines are getting ready to invade against the Israelites. They're getting ready to fight. So let's see what happens. This is in chapter 29. And Jess, if we go verse 1 through 11, we're going to see that David actually is going to get kicked out now by the Philistines.
Oh, boy.
And let's see what happens here.
The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites camped at the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands, David and his men marched at the rear of King Achish. But Philistine commanders demanded, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish told them, "This is David, the servant of King Saul of Israel. He's been with me for years, and I've never found a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today." But the Philistine commanders were angry. "Send him back to the town you've given him," they demanded. "He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and becomes our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our heads over to him?
Yeah.
Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000? That spread really fast."
Yeah, he remembers.
So Achish finally summoned David and said to him, "I swear by the Lord that you have been a trustworthy ally. I think you should go with me into battle, for I've never found a single flaw in you from the day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't upset them, but go back quietly." "What have I done to deserve this treatment?" David demanded. "What have you ever found in your servant that I can't go and fight the enemies of my lord the king?" But Achish insisted, "As far as I'm concerned, you're as perfect as an angel of God. But the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in the battle. Now get up early in the morning and leave with your men as soon as it gets light." So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines while the Philistine army went on to Jezreel.
Okay, so the last thing we knew about David is he had created a dilemma for himself because he had lied to the king of Achish, and King Achish thinks David's loyal to him.
She
No.
says no, he didn't lie.
Oh, okay. Anyway,
It was,
deceit
selective truth
or
telling.
selective
They
truth
saw
telling.
no fault in
Yes.
him.
Achish thinks David's completely loyal because all the spoils he's been bringing back, and he, even though David was raiding other enemies of Israel, Achish thought he was raiding Israelite towns. Okay, now so his efforts made him look good from both sides of the fence, but we noticed that in all along there, because he was actually benefiting Israel by taking out enemy territory, but he was also looking like he was benefiting King Achish. King Achish thought all this spoil was coming from Israelite towns being, so he was walking the fence, keeping both sides happy in a sense, okay? And but since Achish thinks he's so loyal, he makes David his bodyguard and expects all of them to come to war with him. And what do the princes of the Philistines do when they see this band of Israelites at the end of the parade ground?
They said, "What are they doing here?"
What are all these Hebrews? What? Here they ask Achish. They says, "What is this? Why David? And he's Israel's prince and all his men. What are they doing here with your army?" And how does Achish respond when he's asked about David and why David's with the army?
"He's my servant."
Yeah, he basically tells them, he gives this glowing report. Well, David's joined forces with me, and he's been my faithful, loyal servant for years. And of course, we know David's been settled there from about 18 months at this point. He'd been settled in Philistine territory for more than 18 months. And Achish, of course, is still completely convinced. He's got David working for him.
That's one guy that's been
so
duped big time.
convinced. Okay, now what is the reason? What is the reason the Philistine princes are concerned about David being there? Even?
Because he could turn on them at a moment's notice.
they're smart, actually. They believe that David and his men have probably infiltrated their army so that they could go with them to battle in Israel and then turn on the Philistines and slaughter them. They knew David's reputation for killing tens of thousands compared to Saul's 1,000. So they were not afraid of Saul. They were afraid of David. They were afraid of David, okay? So, and I too, I wrote in here as a note of my thing, as a note, the song about David has come back to haunt him again. And this is the third time that song has caused David issues. The third time. The first time that song came out is what caused Saul to hate David, because of the song about David killing 10,000 to Saul's 1,000. Then we saw when he went to King Achish the first time, when David tried to settle among the Philistines when he was hiding out from Saul, it was the song about that the women sang about the 10,000s and the thousands that the women sang that the people told him about, and they told King Achish about, and King Achish didn't want David there because of that song. And then now the song has come back to haunt him once again. Okay. So when Achish dismisses David and he's going back home, how does David respond to Achish? It's kind of interesting to me that how David responds to him when he says, "You got to go back."
Have I ever deceived you?
He acts like he's just severely hurt by this whole thing, doesn't he? How could they mistrust me? He says, "What have I ever done for them to treat me this way?" He wants to know what he's done to even deserve them treating him this way. And it's just kind of funny because he has this act going completely. I mean, and he's got them all sucking into it. It's crazy. He may have deluded himself by this time. I don't know. But notice that in verse 9 that Achish describes David, and you mentioned it.
As an angel of God.
He calls him, "You've been in my sight as an angel of God." And that Achish would even reference the Lord or his God is crazy. What do you think of that statement there? That's
really out of place. Right.
Well, it seems to me like maybe David's had a little more godly influence over this guy.
Yeah, or else he's been such a supreme actor and skillful liar that he's got him totally duped.
No,
he really kind of does.
Maybe they talked around the fireplace.
Achish thinks he's an angel.
It kind of sounds like a figure of speech, too. It's like, oh, well, isn't your little girl a little angel? It's something you say.
Nowadays, yes, we don't know about then in how they thought that thing, because you're dealing with pagan people. That's why I thought it was funny at the one point where he says in my version, "As the Lord lives," or something. Yes, surely as the Lord lives, you've been upright. In verse 6, Achish actually says that. Surely as the Lord lives. So it's like, okay, either he's using lingo that he's heard David say, and he knows that will mean something to David, or whatever. But he's really trying to pat this thing over and keep David calm. Notice. He's trying to keep David calm about the whole thing. Why would he try to do that?
You don't want to.
Because they're scared spitless of David and his men.
Yeah.
The Philistines were scared, and they had right to be. David single-handedly took out their giant, and so Achish is really trying to smooth over what these Philistine lords are doing. Yes, they
don't get him mad.
Okay, so Achish says, just go back to Ziklag, just go back to your home, and David does. He sends them home. David does return with his men, and then the Philistines go on and advance in the battle. It would be really interesting to know, though, what David would have done had he gone into battle.
The first drop of Israelite blood.
Yes, he would have turned on the Philistines.
They were wacko.
They would have been toast in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay, but we'll never know because David did leave. Okay, so
might have saved Saul's
to me,
life too.
It's an amazing show of God's grace and mercy over David, because most believe that David was likely out of God's will by being in Philistine territory to begin with.
But at least
and living a lie among the Philistines. But it was David's fear of Saul that caused him to do it. He did not trust Saul. And rightfully so, because Saul had come after him.
This way?
Yes. So, God already knows how this battle is going to turn out, how this Philistine-Israelite battle is going to turn out. As Saul has already been told that Israel was going to lose this battle and that he and his sons would be killed. So to me, it's good that David wasn't there. because David could never be accused of being the one who tried to kill Saul. Had David gone to battle with the Philistines, and Saul, of course, we're going to see Saul does die, David could have been accused of killing Saul because he was fighting with the Philistines, supposedly. Okay, so this is God's mercy on David by giving him this out to get him to go back home. And so he was saved from having to choose what to do in battle, and he was saved from being accused for what happens in the battle. Okay, so in spite of everything that's gone on, in spite of all the deception that David's done, again, David has been protected from possible death. And as Israel's future king, he needed to be protected. So it's really just amazing to me, God's mercy there. Okay, but let's go on into chapter 30, because we're going to see that as he comes back from being sent home by Achish, something has been happening at home while he's been gone. Let's look at verses 1 through 10, chapter 30, 1 Samuel 1 through 10. The Amalekites have invaded David's city of Ziklag. Go ahead, Laura. Verse 1 to 10.
3 days later, when David and his men arrived home at their town of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and Ziklag. They had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They had carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized that what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then he said to Abiathar, the priest, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought it. Then David asked the Lord, "Should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them?" And the Lord told him, "Yes, go after them. You will surely recover everything that was taken from you." So David and his 600 men set out, and they came to the brook Besor. But 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross the brook. So David continued the pursuit with 400 men.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting how your version condenses how New Living condenses that. Okay, so now we find that all of David's deception and behavior the previous months didn't slide by completely without consequence, because now it is kind of a case of something has happened, you're reaping what you sow kind of thing, because David comes back to Ziklag after being released by Achish, and he finds stuff has happened. What's happened when they come back to their city? Okay. One of the people, the Amalekites, was one of Israel's enemies that David and his men had raided during those raids while David was coming in and out from King Achish. And so some Amalekites decided that they were going to take some vengeance and revenge on David.
That makes sense.
And they come to their town when all the men, David and all the men are gone, except for maybe some elderly men maybe that were there. But the women and children and any men that didn't go to war are there left. And they had taken them all hostage and burned down the city. Here's the city that Achish had given them, and they were living in them instead of having to live in tents. And now the city's been burned down. So you can imagine the shock that this was to David and his men. Prior to this point, they didn't know anything had happened, and now they don't even know if their families are dead or alive. All they know is that the city's been burned down, and all their women and children are gone.
They didn't find any dead bodies.
Right. They must not. Yeah, there weren't any dead bodies, but what was their initial reaction to seeing this devastation?
They wept and wept.
They grieved. Yeah. Have you ever been to the point where you cried so much you couldn't cry anymore? Maybe a couple times in my life. It'd be very rare for that to happen to me, but this is how it was. The grief was so deep when they came back and they discovered this. And after they had time to think about things, what was the reaction of David and then his men? What happened to David after he cried? He became what?
Angry.
Okay, he was very distressed. That's how my version put it. He became really, really distressed, verse 6. And the men, what did they do?
They were angry.
They started to blame David for what had happened to their families.
Notice the new
They
one
wanted to
said
stone him.
he was in great danger.
Yes, they were going to
The
stone him.
reason for his stress.
His own men were going to stone him because of what
It's David's
happened.
fault.
Yes. Now, to me, that this is a great example of how hurting people hurt people, and they turn to anger to try to deal with their hurt. It's very much human nature. There's a famous quote about that: hurting people hurt people. It's really, really true, because usually anger starts in. When people are hurting, anger is like a second step in a whole hurting type process. Why do you suppose they blame David? Why would they want to stone him?
Because it was his fault. They were out doing this fake fighting with the Philistines and not there to protect their family.
Okay. Yeah, they blamed David for taking them away from the city, from the families. And of course, they needed somebody to blame. Isn't that true? How when most people are grieving something, they have to find someone to blame? Why do we have so many lawsuits in America? It's because people want to blame everybody for something. There's so many doctor malpractice suits. Somebody dies, immediately the people want to sue the doctor for their loved one dying. It's a blame game thing of wanting to blame somebody for when something happens. When they can't deal with the reality, they look for somebody to blame. Now, what did verse 6 tell us that David did while he was in distress? That was critical to me. Well, even before that,
He encouraged himself.
he encouraged himself in the Lord. Mine says he strengthened himself in the Lord. So his sustenance was coming from God, because he could feel the men starting to turn on him and blame him, and yet he had to get in his mind, he had to not let it affect him. He had to strengthen himself in the Lord. That's good. A good example for us when we get into a distressed state. That's the best place to turn immediately. I mean, it's great to have friends, and it's great to have a spouse to turn to if they can be an encouragement to you in those situations. But your best place to turn when you're this distressed is to turn to the Lord and get your strengthening from the Lord. And that's what David did, and that is a good example for us. And what's interesting, though, to me, is that this is the first time in the 16 to 18 months that he'd been in Gath that we could see anything about David doing anything with God. It's the first time that we see him really even talking about God or strengthening himself in God, because he's just been on these raids. He's been hiding out. He's been fearful of Saul, and we haven't heard anything. So it's like he's in this new low point in his life. I don't know if he just finally saw that things went really bad because he had maybe stepped out of God's will by going into Philistine territory. Maybe he was wondering about that. Maybe I brought all these men into this territory. We should have never been here. If I hadn't come to the Philistine territory, none of this would have happened. I mean, you can see the cycle of things that were probably going through his mind. And yet he's still even grieving. His own wives and children were in there, were part of the ones that were taken. Okay, what else did David do for the first time in months?
He asked for God.
He actually inquired of the Lord. He asked for the ephod to be brought. It's his first time that we've seen it. And all the time he's been with the Philistines, this is the first time. So it's been at least 18 months. And he asked for the ephod so that he could ask God what to do. And this action actually is more like the old David, because before this time of him running from Saul and all that, he actually would have used to inquire of the Lord a lot, but not since he'd been in Philistine territory had he talked to God or inquired of God. And some commentators do say that. They believe that David was totally out of the will of God by being in Philistine territory. He should never have been there. He's supposed to be the future king of Israel.
God,
they say he should have never left Israel.
He was in greater peace
That's
when he was over there.
Yeah.
They have Saul after him every 10 minutes.
Even though he was still thinking in his mind he was doing Israel a favor by raiding the enemies of Israel, some commentators really do believe that he was out of God's will. Okay, now when David did use the Urim and Thummim from the ephod, the high priest ephod, what did God tell him when he asked what he should do about these raiders that came and destroyed his town, his city? God said, pursue. Go after him. Not only that, but he told them to pursue, and what would happen? God told them what would happen. You will prevail. You will recover everything without fail. So imagine how that little piece of information encouraged David. That had to have encouraged him greatly. And so not just the news that he's going to be able to overtake the enemy, but the news that he was going to recover everything without fail. He was going to recover all the families. So now he knew that the families were alive. This was the first time he actually knows, because God said, you will recover all without fail. So he knew he was going to recover the families. They weren't dead. God was going to enable him to bring them back. Okay, so I wrote this in your notes. This is another instance of God's mercy on David. Because back when we're told that David raided some Amalekite cities, he killed everything that breathed so that no one could inform on him to Saul or inform on him to Achish so that he could keep his little deception alive. Okay, but when the Amalekites raided David's city, God must have supernaturally protected the families because those Amalekites did not kill them. It's amazing. David slaughtered everything, even their livestock, or the good stuff. He kept all the good spoil and took it back to Achish. But he killed everything that breathed, even the babies. It's like, oh, how could you do that? But somehow God supernaturally protected David's family. I mean, they did get taken, but they were not killed. And the Amalekites had every right to kill. In fact, the Arab laws of revenge demanded an eye for an eye. If you killed our families, then we are going to kill yours. But somehow God protected those people, his families, and the families of the men from being killed. And after David hears from God, it didn't take him any time. Boom, spurs him to action, and they immediately get on the trail of the Amalekites who have kidnapped their families. But then they encounter a little bit of a problem because they've already been marching for 3 days. They get to this creek they have to cross, and a third of the men are so weary they cannot function to go any further. They're just faint from fatigue and all the emotional upheaval, and it's overtaken them, and they can't do it. And so David leaves the ones that felt fatigued and had fatigue overtaken. He says, you guys stay here, and we're going to move on with the 400 men, and we're going to deal with these dudes.
They leave the supplies with those guys? Yes,
they left them by the brook and anything they had with them. Remember, all they had was what they had with them because the whole city had been burned down. Any supplies they'd had back in the city were gone. Anything that was there. So all they had was what was with them. All right, so let's see what does happen. This will be our last passage for tonight. Verses 11 through 20. Jason, if you could read for us, and we're going to see what really does happen because just as God said, David recovers all. Go ahead, verse 11.
So along the way they found an Egyptian man in a field, brought him to David, gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They also gave him part of a fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, for he hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 3 days and nights. Before long his strength returned. Says, to whom do you belong and where do you come from? David asked him. I am an Egyptian, a slave and an Amalekite, he replied. My master abandoned me 3 days ago because I was sick. We were on our way back from raiding the Kerethites in the Negev, the territory of Judah and the land of Caleb, and we had just burned Ziklag. Will you lead me into this band of raiders? David asked. The young man replied, if you take an oath in God's name that you will not kill me or give me back to my master, then I will guide you to them. So he led David to them, and they found the Amalekites spread out across the fields, eating and drinking and dancing with joy because of the vast amount of plunder they had taken from the Philistines and the land of Judah. David and his men rushed in among them and slaughtered them throughout the night, the entire next day until evening. None of the Amalekites escaped except 400 young men who fled on camels. David got back everything the Amalekites had taken, and he rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, small or great, son or daughter, or anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. He also recovered all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock. This plunder belongs to David, they said.
Okay, so again we see God at work for David, because here he's going out. He has no clue where these guys went. He has no idea where the Amalekites took off after they burned down his city. And just happens to run across this fella, okay, this young Egyptian, nearly dead from starvation because he had no food or water for 3 days. And they question him where he's from, and he gives them prize intel about the very enemy that David is out to find. This kid has no idea that this is David, who's from Ziklag, the city David has burned. He just starts revealing, well, you know, after they gave him food and he was able to come to life again, pretty much, he just says, you know, I was a slave and Amalekite guy, but I got sick when they went to do these things, and they just left me. And this really was not unusual. In this culture, slaves were treated no better than animals. If they were sick, most times they were just abandoned to die. They didn't even try to take care of them. They were of no value to them if they were sick. But this slave reveals that his master's army had raided several places in the Philistine area and in the Judah and in the city of Ziklag. Just happened to have been there and done that. And David jumps on this intel, and he asks for help to find the troop of raiders. And he makes a deal with the Egyptian. The Egyptian says, well, sure, I'll take you to them as long as you promise you won't kill me. And what else did he say? Promise what? You won't give me back to them, my old master. Because that guy didn't even want to take care of him. He said, I don't want to go back to him. So he makes a deal with the Egyptian that he wouldn't be killed and he won't be turned back to his master. And he agrees to show David where the enemy is camped. And what does David find when he's brought to the enemy camp?
They're dancing and drinking.
They're having a huge party because of all they had taken. They're eating of the spoils, drinking, having a big party, dancing. They were totally unaware about what was fixing to hit them.
And they didn't have anybody guarded posted.
Nope, no guards, no nothing.
They weren't worried. They burned it down.
Exactly. They had no. Exactly. So we don't have any real information about the fight, but except for it's described as the time frame. What was the time frame listed there? They fought from
day till night,
sundown one night, all through the next day, all the way to sundown the next night. Okay, so we're talking a 24-hour fight. David has 600 guys, and it says 400 Amalekites, only 400 Amalekites survived.
He only had 200 that actually fought.
Well, yeah, that's true. He left 200 by the troops, so he only has 400. And here it says that 400 Amalekites escaped. So David and his men, David and his men were fighting for 24 hours. God supernaturally empowered their bodies because they had just come from a 3-day travels when they got back to Ziklag. They immediately took off towards trying to find the raiders. And so we're talking about 4 or 5 days they have been going to fight. No wonder those 200 by the brook were wiped out. It had already been nearly a 4-day tirade, and now they were going to try to do more. These guys fight for 24 hours. God supernaturally strengthened their bodies for them to be able to do this. It just shows you when you've got the word of the Lord, no matter how much you feel in your own self that you can do, God can supernaturally infuse into the situation. It's just awesome to me that happens. But what was the outcome of the battle?
He got everything back.
Yes, he rescued his wives and all the other family members. They recovered all the livestock, all the items, anything that had been taken from Ziklag, and anything that, all the rest of the stuff they had taken from other Philistine cities and other cities. David ended up, they lost nothing. They ended up getting increase by the time it was all over. So it's really amazing. And they actually called the rest of it, they called it David's spoil because there was so much. So how do you think David felt once this battle was over? Great, yes, great relief. Look what God did. Because this was all a God thing, and here he hadn't really talked to God a whole lot the previous 16 to 18 months. and now here God had brought him an amazing victory. They did lose their city, but they gained back everything that had been taken. Everything that had been taken, whatever the enemy had taken, they got back, plus. That's why I love that verse. It says, when the thief is found out, he has to restore sevenfold. Because God, that's just how God is. Okay, David didn't know it, but his fight with the Amalekites this day actually was acting on one of Moses' prophecies that he made back in the book of Exodus. And the Lord said this to Moses. It says, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called its name, the Lord is my banner. For the Lord had said, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So here we see David was involved in starting to take over this victory. Now, it's interesting to me that this particular fight with the Amalekites, we know he'd been raiding them before, but this particular fight with the Amalekites, even though 400 of them got away, this fight was so complete that the Amalekites are never spoken of again in 1st and 2nd Samuel or in 1st and 2nd Kings. It's like it had taken them out so severely, they only had a remnant of people left of the Amalekites by the time Kings is even over with. They're not even mentioned again in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That's amazing. But you can really see the character of God at work here. And that's where we'll have to pick up next week.
Can I make a little comment?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how much of you guys are like me. Even though the Bible plainly mentions what we would call ghosts, spirits of the dead, and it mentions witches, how many of you, when you were growing up, heard your parents say, there's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as witches.
In our culture,
Didn't they read?
Well, my mom and dad knew more about demons and all that stuff, so they never would say that. They would tell us there's no monsters, but yet we were aware there was evil. And in your culture, Kua, you probably had a lot.
Oh, they couldn't say that because we saw a lot of
You saw the witches all the time.
Yeah, we saw crazy unexplained stuff, so they wouldn't say that.
Right. So you saw the activity of demons and witches all the time.
Possess people and all crazy stuff.
But don't you think that in my time, most of the churches taught that there were no ghosts. My mother used to say, "Oh, that's just superstition. People believe that because they want to."
That's just Harry Potter stuff. It's not real.
Yeah.
I think
they're trying to keep their kids from being fearful.
Yeah, the more educated people would say that all that stuff is not real.
Well, just like they say God and angels are not real. They say it doesn't exist.
And the Holy Ghost.
But and a lot of that's to try to alleviate the fear of children.
So they have Santa Claus.
Well, I understand from that standpoint, that you wouldn't want them to be afraid. But to me, the answer to that is to teach them about God.
Well, that's what we had to do with Jess. She really struggled with fear as a child. We had to just get her scriptures over and over again, prayer, lots of praying, trying to get her to get over and pass that fear till she got old enough to where she could start combating it herself.
Right.
Because it was real. She always had a very strong sense of feeling for the presence of evil, even when she was little.
Really?
Yeah. She would tell us she felt creepy things even when she was little. So I don't know if your spirit was just extra sensitive, even from a child, or what, but I know you really battled the fear.
I saw that spirit that night in that attic at the church in Commerce.
In Commerce, you saw one. Yeah, well, this was I was thinking of when we were in Pahrump. And someone had told us that, when we were, well, I don't know, we're past time, but when we were in Pahrump, the parsonage that was built at the back of the church, back in the 5 acres, and they had brought in 2 mobile homes and joined them together. And it kind of made it like a triple wide, but they were older homes. And someone had said that the people who had owned the places before were a bunch of rebel rousers. And so...
The rebel state.
And of course, Nevada being the rebel state, you don't have very many Christians there to begin with. And so some people said they thought that it was possible that there could have been some spirits hanging around in there. But yet I was even strong enough to believe, though, that we still had authority over them.
Yeah.
Even at that time, I really believed that we had authority over them.
Yes.
And that's what I tried to do, was to try to teach Jess, even though she was little, 4, 5, 6 years old,
Right.
to try to understand that just believers in Jesus. And those VeggieTales song was so great. God is bigger than the boogeyman made such an impact on her that she used to sing that VeggieTales song all the time, because she had to get that in her head, that God's bigger than that. Even though that may be there, God is still bigger than that. And so that's how you have to handle those situations. And we had to tell that to ourselves. I don't know if you've ever been places where you felt the creepiness of evil.
Oh, yeah.
I know there was the one hotel in Las Vegas that's built like a pyramid, the Luxor. When they had their grand opening, they were having all kinds of specials and stuff for their restaurants and stuff. So we went there to go eat and get cheap food in Vegas, because that's how they get you in their casinos. So we go to the restaurants. But when we went in there, after we had been in there a little while, I sensed a spirit in just being inside the pyramid. It was very weird to me, that I didn't sense in other casinos. We'd been at restaurants in other casinos, and it had never really been as huge of an evil feeling as it was in that pyramid. And I finally told the people we were with, I said, "Can we leave? It was affecting me physically. That the presence was so strong there." So there's stuff out there. We're foolish if we don't believe. There's this whole supernatural world. We're told in Ephesians that there's principalities and powers, and we're not dealing with flesh and blood. A lot of times we're dealing with those spirits that are operating behind people and are operating in situations, in places. People say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a haunted house." Any house that has spirits in it could be considered. If the demon spirits are operating, and people invite them in, like the witch would normally do. So it's not for us to be afraid of those things, though. We have been given authority over those. And if you are fearful of those things, read the book of Ephesians. We've been seated higher, because we're seated in heavenly places with Jesus, which is far above all principalities and powers and rulers of this.
I like what Pastor says. Only 1/3 of the angels fell. 2/3 are good angels, and they minister to us.
That's right, and they're assigned to us to be ministering spirits. That's right. We got 2/3 or so. So we're on the winning side, and that's how it is. And that's all because of what Jesus. We have to learn to walk in it. That's right.
That's the thing, because I grew up thinking God's will, was going to be done.
Regardless.
There really wasn't too much point in my praying, or I did just to teach my children to pray. But I thought whatever happened,
that everything that happened was God's will.
Yeah.
And that's not true either. No, because people have choice. And once people have choice, then it's taken out of the building. Now, God can ultimately work things to his plan and purpose, but we got to pray that plan and purpose to come to pass in the earth. That's why our prayers are so important. Yeah. God needs our prayers. God needs our voice to speak it out into this realm. He's limited himself to work through his people, and we need to be willing to do that and to get the message out.
But I think that was a tradition in the churches at that time.
Yes, it was. It was.
To deny the existence.
And I'm glad that some have got revelation of the word that has freed us from.
Well, I didn't until I got into Spirit-filled church.
Yeah, that makes a big difference, doesn't it? Well, anyway, we're leaving David having a good victory here. Next week we'll actually read Saul's end, which is pretty sad. Even though he's been a pitiful man, it's really sad to see the end that takes place. But God protected David from actually being there when it happens, so that he could not be blamed for the death of Saul. And I think God worked in many myriads of ways in the whole situation to protect David and to bring about his plan. By the time Saul dies, he's about 60 years old. And so for 40 years, he continued to reign, even though David knew from a young man that he was going to replace him and be the next king. But it took a while to get there. And yet David has gone through some things. And in the end, it'll ultimately will prepare him from what's coming in the future. But it's been tough. And so anyway, Father, we thank you for this example that we have, that even though things get tough while we're waiting, that you will bring to pass that which you've spoken. I thank you that we can strengthen ourselves in the Lord. I thank you that we have the scriptures. David didn't have anything but the law but to go by, but he had such revelation of you that we have what things David even thought about and said while he was in this place and in his life. And I thank you that we have the scriptures. The word is powerful. The word helps us understand. And I thank you that we have this preserved for us. I pray that you will help us to look to you in situations that are difficult and overwhelming, in our distress, that you're the first place we turn to. And I thank you for the peace and the comfort and the guidance that comes as we look to you. I thank you for the Holy Spirit that dwells within us, that is our guide and our teacher. I pray that you help us to rely on him more and in our everyday lives, in any situation we come to, that we would look to the Holy Spirit for guidance and to teach us how to operate and how to live in each situation we face. We thank you, Father, for your goodness. And till we come together again, may we be peace and love and safety over each one. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks for joining us, guys. And,
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Thank you. Good night.
night, Sam. Good night, Coach.